There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary. A Tuesday evening, a casual question, the hum of a refrigerator in a quiet apartment. They wear the camouflage of the mundane, and you don't realize their weight until they have already passed, leaving behind a silence that is shaped exactly like the words you wish you had said. For me, that moment arrived on the third Tuesday in October, a day that was utterly unremarkable until it became the day that everything either ended or began. It was the moment I told Sam I had a date, and in his reaction, I saw the collapse of the quiet, fragile world we had built together in the spaces between words. He had been standing by the kitchen counter, scrolling through his phone with that distracted intensity he always had when he was trying to avoid a thought. His shoulders were tense, a roadmap of the stress from his latest business trip. He'd only been back for a day, but he'd spent the night at my place, as had become the unspoken custom. He claimed my couch was a preventative measure against his own empty apartment, a place he said echoed too loudly since Chloe had left. I never pointed out that he hadn't slept on the couch in months. The fiction was delicate, a thin sheet of glass we both pretended not to see, and I was terrified of being the one to shatter it. I was rinsing a coffee mug in the sink, the warm water a small comfort against my skin. My heart was a frantic bird against my ribs. I had been practicing this all day, running the sentence through my mind until it lost all meaning, hoping that by repeating it enough, I could strip it of its power. "I have a date on Friday," I said. The words left my mouth and seemed to hang in the air, thick and unnatural. They didn't sound like my words. They sounded like a line from a play, rehearsed and hollow. I didn't look at him. I focused on the suds circling the drain, a tiny, meaningless whirlpool. The scrolling sound from his phone stopped. The silence that followed was not the comfortable, lived-in silence we usually shared. It was a vacuum. It pulled the air from my lungs. I could feel his eyes on the back of my neck, and the sensation was so acute it was almost a physical touch, a burn. When he finally spoke, his voice was dangerously low, stripped of all its usual warmth. It was a stranger's voice. A date. I forced myself to turn around, to lean back against the counter as if this were the most casual conversation in the world. I even managed a small, tight shrug. "Yeah, with that guy, Mark." From the gallery opening. Sam's face was a mask. His jaw was clenched so tightly a muscle pulsed near his temple. He slid his phone onto the granite counter, the sound unnervingly loud in the stillness. He looked at me, truly looked at me, and his eyes were dark with something I couldn't decipher. It wasn't just surprise. It was something sharper, something that felt like betrayal. "You're going on a date," he repeated, not as a question, but as an accusation. "People do that," I said, my attempt at lightness falling completely flat. My own voice sounded thin. "It's just coffee." "Just coffee," he echoed, a bitter, hollow sound. He took a step forward, closing the space between us. The air grew thick, charged with a voltage I had only ever felt in the dead of night when he was asleep beside me. "So all of this," he gestured vaguely, a sweep of his hand that seemed to encompass the whole apartment, the past few months, the space between our bodies. What was all of this, then? My breath caught in my throat. My carefully constructed nonchalance crumbled into dust. "All of what, Sam? You were crashing here. Your girlfriend left. You were lonely. I'm your friend. That's what this is." Even as I said it, the words tasted like a lie. They were the official story, the one we had tacitly agreed upon, but they weren't the truth. The truth was in the way his leg would press against mine under the blankets, the way my name sounded when he'd whisper it in the dark, half asleep, as if to make sure I was still there. He let out a sharp, incredulous laugh that had no humor in it. It was the sound of something breaking. "Your friend? Leo, I've spent more nights in your bed than I have in my own for the last 6 months. We don't just exist in the same space. We share it." He took another step. He was so close now I could feel the heat radiating from his body. I could smell the faint scent of the soap from my shower on his skin. My own heartbeat was a deafening drum in my ears. "I thought," he started, his voice cracking on the word. He looked away, at the floor, at the ceiling, anywhere but at me. He looked utterly lost, like a man who had just realized the map he'd been following was for a different country entirely. He shook his head, a gesture of pure disbelief. He finally met my eyes again, and they were filled with a raw, wounded confusion that mirrored my own. I got mad, he whispered, the anger draining away, leaving behind something far more vulnerable, far more terrifying. I got mad when you said you had a date. He paused, and the silence stretched, holding a question I was too afraid to ask. I thought we were just us. Us. That one, simple word. It was not a confession of love, not a declaration, but it was everything. It was an acknowledgement of the invisible architecture we had built around ourselves, the unspoken rules of our shared solitude. It was the name for the thing I had been trying so desperately not to name myself, for fear that speaking it aloud would make it vanish. And in that moment, with his bewildered anger hanging in the air like smoke, I knew that I had not misread a single thing. I had just underestimated the fear that came with it. And to understand how we got there, to that precipice in my kitchen, you have to understand the foundation we were built on. You have to go back. I met Sam in our sophomore year of college, thrown together by the chaotic lottery of student housing. He was a force of nature, a whirlwind of kinetic energy. He was on the swim team, a physics major who seemed to absorb complex theories as easily as he breathed. His side of the room was an organized explosion of textbooks, damp towels, and protein bar wrappers. He moved through the world with an unearned confidence that I, a quiet arts student who spent most of my time in the campus darkroom, found both mystifying and magnetic. My space was Spartan, ordered, a reflection of the carefully controlled quiet I tried to maintain in my own head. We were a study in contrasts, oil and water, and for the first few months, we orbited each other with a polite distance. The friendship didn't click into place with a sudden bang, but with a slow, gradual fusion. It began with late-night study sessions where I'd help him with his mandatory English essays and he'd try, usually in vain, to explain the elegance of thermodynamics to me. It solidified over cheap pizza and bad movies, over him defending my abstract photography projects to his jock friends, and me learning to read the tension in his shoulders after a disappointing swim meet. He was the sun, and I suppose, was the moon. He generated his own light, and I was content to reflect it, to observe it. I learned the cartography of his moods, the bright, easy grin that meant a good practice, the slight downturn of his mouth that signaled exhaustion, the focused stillness that meant he was wrestling with a problem, be it in physics or in his life. And somewhere in those quiet moments of observation, my admiration for his light began to transform into something deeper, something warmer and more private. It was a slow-burn ache I learned to live with, a feeling I packed away into a small, locked room in my heart. He was my best friend. That was the role I had been assigned, the one I was determined to play perfectly. He was unapologetically, unequivocally straight. He dated a string of bright, bubbly girls who all seemed to be variations on a theme, culminating in Chloe, whom he met senior year. She was smart and funny, and she loved him in a way that was obvious and uncomplicated. And I, from my designated spot in the friend zone, watched them build a life together, and I buried my feelings under layers of loyalty and self-preservation. Loving Sam was a photograph I could develop only in the dark, a secret I kept for myself. After graduation, our lives diverged in practice, but not in spirit. I pursued photography, a career that suited my temperament, one of patience and observation, of waiting for the right light. I found a small, sun-drenched apartment in the city and made a life out of capturing other people's perfect moments. Sam, with his brilliant mind and restless energy, went into software consulting. It was a job that sent him flying across the country, living out of sterile hotel rooms and navigating the high-pressure world of corporate problem-solving. It was a life that looked glamorous from the outside, but I knew, from our weekly phone calls, the toll it took. He was always chasing deadlines, always in a different time zone, always a little bit lonely. Our friendship became an anchor for both of us. My apartment was his home base, the place he'd drop his bags between trips, the place we'd order takeout and debrief his latest corporate battle or my latest frustrating photo shoot. He would stretch out on my couch, his long limbs taking up the entire space, and the restless energy would finally seep out of him, leaving behind the quiet, thoughtful man I knew better than anyone. He would tell me about his life with Chloe, their plans to buy a house, their arguments about where to spend the holidays. I was his confidant, his sounding board, the keeper of the parts of himself he couldn't show the rest of the world. And I was good at it. I was so good at it that I think even I sometimes forgot about the locked room inside me, about the photograph I could only look at when I was completely alone. I loved him as a friend so fiercely that it almost felt like enough. Almost. The shift began not with a tremor, but with an earthquake. It was a rainy Tuesday night when he called me, his voice hollowed out, flattened by a grief so profound it seemed to have stolen all his air. "She's gone, Leo," he'd said, and I didn't have to ask who he meant. "Chloe. She packed her things. She said she couldn't do it anymore. The travel, the distanced me." He had just landed from a 2-week project in Seattle. He'd walked into their shared apartment to find a note on the kitchen table and a hollow space in the closet where her clothes used to be. For 8 years, Chloe had been his North Star. Her departure didn't just leave him single. It left him fundamentally unmoored, adrift in a sea of a future he had never planned for. The life he had been so certain of had been revealed as a mirage. That night, he showed up at my door, drenched from the rain, looking smaller than I had ever seen him. He wasn't the confident, sunlit force of nature I knew. He was just a man who had lost his way home. He didn't cry. He just stood in my living room, dripping onto the hardwood floor, and looked around as if seeing it for the first time. "Can I?" he started, unable to finish the sentence. "Of course," I said, already taking his wet jacket. "The couch is yours for as long as you need it." And that was the catalyst. It wasn't a malicious act on his part, or a calculated one. It was born of pure, desperate need. He was drowning, and my quiet, stable apartment was the only shore in sight. He started seeking a new kind of comfort from me, a level of proximity that began to smudge the carefully drawn lines of our friendship. He wasn't just my friend anymore. He was a refugee, and I was his sanctuary. And in that sanctuary, the old, unspoken rules began to fray, one by one, until they unraveled completely. The ritual began with the couch. For the first few weeks after Chloe left, Sam treated my apartment like a glorified hotel with a sympathetic manager. He'd come back from his consulting trips, exhausted and hollow-eyed, and collapse onto my worn leather sofa without even taking off his shoes. He'd fall asleep with the television murmuring, a half-eaten container of pad thai on the coffee table beside him. In the mornings, I would find him there, tangled in the throw blanket I'd draped over him, looking young and vulnerable in the pale dawn light. I'd make coffee, and we'd sit in a comfortable, wounded silence before he'd shower and head to his office or back to his own empty apartment for a few hours. It was a pattern born of necessity, of his profound need not to be alone with the ghosts of his former life. I understood that. I was his friend, and this was the shape of my friendship now, providing a safe harbor. I was careful to keep a certain distance, a boundary of unspoken respect for his grief. I told myself his presence was purely logistical. I was a barrier against the silence. But even then, my heart had begun to beat to a new, more dangerous rhythm. Having him here, in my space, sleeping just a room away, was a constant, low-grade fever. I would lie awake in my own bed, listening for the sound of his breathing from the living room, a soft, rhythmic tide that filled the quiet spaces of my home. It was a kind of sweet agony, a proximity I had never allowed myself to want so explicitly. The first escalation was subtle, almost imperceptible. One night, about a month into this new arrangement, I was woken by a soft sound from the doorway of my bedroom. I opened my eyes to see Sam standing there, a silhouette against the faint light filtering in from the street. He was holding a pillow. "Leo," he whispered, his voice thick with sleep. "You awake?" My heart hammered against my ribs. "Yeah. What's wrong?" "Nothing," he said quickly. "It's just, your couch is a torture device designed by a sadist." My back is killing me. He shifted his weight, and I could hear the genuine discomfort in his voice. Do you mind if I just crash on the floor in here? It's warmer. It was the perfect excuse. Plausible. Deniable. A request so reasonable it would be cruel to refuse. But we both knew my floor was hardwood. My brain screamed at me, a cacophony of warnings about crossed lines and dangerous territory. The locked room in my heart began to rattle, but my mouth formed the words my heart wanted. Don't be an idiot, Sam. The floor is freezing. There's plenty of room in the bed. The silence that followed was charged, electric. I watched his silhouette hesitate, a man standing on a threshold. It felt like he was asking for more than just a place to sleep. He was asking for permission to cross a boundary we had both meticulously maintained for a decade. By offering, I was granting it. Are you sure? He asked, his voice softer now, more tentative. I'm sure, I said, my own voice steadier than I felt. I shifted over to my side of the queen-sized bed, creating a wide, open space. An invitation. He walked into the room and deposited his pillow. The sound of him moving in the dark was intimate, the rustle of his sweatpants, the soft sigh as he pulled back the covers on the other side. The mattress dipped with his weight. He lay down on his back, leaving a careful, deliberate foot of space between us. It was a chasm of unspoken rules and nervous energy. We lay there for long minutes, two statues in the dark, both acutely aware of the other's breathing. Thanks, Leo, he murmured eventually, his voice close to my ear. Go to sleep, Sam, I whispered back. And so the ritual evolved. The couch was forgotten. His excuse about his back was used once and then discarded, no longer necessary. After every trip, he would come to my apartment, drop his bags, and that night, he would simply end up in my bed. It became our new normal. The space between us began to shrink. At first, it was accidental, a foot brushing against mine, an arm thrown out in sleep. I would wake in the middle of the night to find him shifted closer, the heat of his body a warm line against my back. I would lie perfectly still, petrified of waking him, of breaking the spell. I was a photographer cataloging every sensory detail. The weight of his arm draped over my waist, the soft puff of his breath against my neck, the faint, clean scent of his skin. My mind was a relentless analyst, turning every gesture over and over, searching for intent, for meaning. Was this just the unconscious seeking of comfort from a grieving man? Or was it something more? I was living in a state of suspended disbelief, caught between a hope so fierce it was painful and a pragmatism that warned me not to read too much into it. The cuddling began tentatively. One cold night, he shivered and mumbled something about the draft from the window. Without a word, I felt him press his front against my back, tucking himself into the curve of my spine. He wrapped an arm around my chest, pulling the comforter tighter around us both. His body was a furnace against mine. My entire nervous system went into overdrive. It felt less like a hug and more like an anchor dropping. It felt like he was holding on for dear life. Warmer. I managed to breathe out, my voice tight. MHMM. He hummed, a sound of pure contentment that vibrated through my whole body. Better. This, too, became part of the ritual. We became sleep-tangled shapes, my back to his chest, his arm a familiar weight across me. The plausible deniability was still there, a thin, transparent veil. He was lonely. He was cold. He needed comfort. These were the reasons. But the reasons felt increasingly flimsy, insufficient to explain the profound, bone-deep rightness of it. It was a nightly performance of intimacy without a script. He was the unknowing initiator, driven by an instinct he refused to name, and I was the quiet observer, memorizing every line and gesture, terrified and thrilled in equal measure. This routine, this shared space in the dark, was both my greatest comfort and my most intense anxiety. It was a fragile ecosystem that felt like it could be destroyed by a single word, a single look in the bright light of day. It was everything, and it was nothing, all at once. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me, that it couldn't last forever. Something had to break. The night it happened was different. There was a stillness in the air, a sense of imminence. like the heavy calm before a thunderstorm. Sam had been back for 2 days from a particularly grueling project in Chicago. He'd been quiet, more introspective than usual, the usual restless energy banked down to a low smolder. We had eaten dinner in comfortable silence, and now we were in bed, settled into our familiar configuration, me on my side, him tucked behind me, his arm draped loosely over my waist. The rhythm of his breathing was a slow, steady tide against my back. For a long time, I thought he was asleep. The only sounds were the distant wail of a siren and the gentle hum of the city outside my window. My own mind was a storm of familiar questions. What are we doing? Where's this going? How can this be enough? I was so lost in my internal monologue that I almost missed it when his breathing pattern changed, becoming shallower, more conscious. The hand resting on my hip tightened ever so slightly. "Leo," he whispered. His voice was a bare thread of sound in the darkness, but it sliced through the quiet with the precision of a scalpel. My heart gave a painful lurch. It knew before I did. "Yeah," I whispered back, my own voice sounding unnaturally loud to my own ears. He didn't say anything for a long moment. I could feel the tension in his body, a taut wire of unspoken thought. He shifted behind me, and I felt him pull his arm back. The loss of his warmth was immediate, a sudden cold spot on my side. I felt a surge of panic. He was pulling away. It was over. The ritual was broken. But then, he moved again. He rolled over onto his back, and then, slowly, tentatively, he turned to face me. I felt the mattress shift as he propped himself up on one elbow, looking down at me. I was still facing away from him, a coward, my eyes squeezed shut. I couldn't bear to see the look on his face, whether it was pity or confusion or an apology for a line he had just realized he'd crossed. "Leo, look at me," he said, his voice still a whisper, but now imbued with a soft, pleading insistence. My body felt like it was encased in lead. It took every ounce of my willpower to obey. I rolled over slowly, my movements stiff and uncertain. My eyes adjusted to the dim light filtering in from the window, the familiar shapes of my room now looking strange and charged with potential. His face was inches from mine. I could see the faint stubble on his jaw, the earnest, anxious look in his eyes. He wasn't looking at me with pity. He was looking at me with an unnerving, raw vulnerability. He swallowed, a small, audible sound. "We've been doing this for a while now," he said, his voice quiet and hoarse. Sleeping. Here. Together." I could only nod, my throat too tight for words. "It's not just about my back, is it?" he asked. It was a genuine question. He was asking me for the truth, for a confirmation of a feeling he was only just now daring to put a name to. "No," I managed to say. The word was a puff of air. "It's not just about your back." A flicker of something, relief, maybe, passed through his eyes. He seemed to be holding his breath. He was searching my face for something, for permission, for a sign that he wasn't alone on this ledge. The silence stretched, filled with the weight of a decade of friendship and months of unspoken intimacy. He lowered his head slightly, bringing his face even closer. The space between our lips was electric. I could feel his breath on my skin. It was warm and unsteady. "Would it be okay," he whispered, his voice trembling almost imperceptibly, "if I kissed you?" The question was a gift. It wasn't a demand, not an assumption. It was an offering of his own vulnerability, a gesture of profound respect for me, for what we were. He was giving me the choice. He was giving me all the power. And in that moment, all the fear, all the anxiety, all the years of hiding and protecting myself, it all just melted away. It was replaced by a single, shining point of clarity. I didn't answer with words. I closed the final inch between us. The kiss was not what I had imagined in my secret, lonely fantasies. It wasn't passionate or desperate. It was tentative. It was soft. It was a question, a discovery. His lips were gentle against mine, a hesitant pressure that asked more than it took. It was a confession made in the dark, a quiet acknowledgement of a truth we had both been too scared to face in the light. It was the sound of a lock clicking open. For a few perfect, suspended seconds, the world stopped. There was no past, no future, only the astonishing, unbelievable reality of his mouth on mine. When he pulled back, it was only by a fraction of an inch. His forehead rested against mine. His eyes were still closed. Okay, he breathed out, a shaky exhale of relief. Yeah, okay. And I thought, with a hope so bright it was blinding, that this was it. This was the beginning. I had no idea it was just the beginning of the fall. The morning after the kiss was a study in dissonance. I woke up alone. The space beside me in the bed was cold, the indentation of his head on the pillow the only evidence he had been there at all. For a disorienting moment, I wondered if I had dreamed it, if the entire, world-altering event had been a product of my own wishful thinking. But then I saw his phone on my nightstand, left behind in his haste. The kiss was real. His absence was, too. A knot of anxiety tightened in my stomach. I got up and walked into the living room. His travel bag, usually left by the door, was gone. A single coffee mug, rinsed and placed carefully in the drying rack, was the only sign he'd been in the kitchen. He had left without a word, a silent retreat that screamed louder than any argument could have. He had fled. The next few days were a special kind of hell. It was the aftermath of a beautiful, terrifying storm, where the sun is out but the wreckage is everywhere. I sent him a simple text. "You forgot your phone." Hours later, a reply came back. "Damn, can you drop it at my office later?" Sorry, morning was crazy. It was so casual, so devoid of the emotional weight of the night before, that it felt like a slap in the face. Crazy. That's what he called it. When I dropped the phone at his downtown office, he met me in the lobby, dressed in a crisp suit that felt like armor. He was all bustling energy and professional smiles, the Sam he showed to his clients, not the man who whispered my name in the dark. He kept a careful physical distance between us. There was no shared glance, no acknowledgement of the seismic shift that had occurred. He thanked me for bringing the phone, clapped me on the shoulder in a gesture that was painfully, performatively platonic, and then he was gone, disappearing back into the elevator. The ritual was broken. He didn't call. He didn't text to say he was coming over. My apartment, which had been a sanctuary for both of us, reverted to being just my apartment. The silence he had come here to escape now filled every corner of my home, a constant, mocking reminder of what I had lost. The quiet I had once cherished now felt like an accusation. My mind became a torture chamber of analysis. I replayed the kiss, the question, the look in his eyes, over and over again, searching for the moment I had misread it all. Had it been a mistake for him? A moment of grief-fueled confusion? Had he woken up in the harsh light of morning and been disgusted by what he'd done, by who I was? The hope that had been so bright just days before curdled into a bitter mix of hurt and anger. I had made myself vulnerable. I had let him into that locked room in my heart, and he had looked around, decided he didn't like the decor, and walked out, leaving the door swinging wide open. I was hurt, but beneath the hurt, a stubborn, protective anger began to grow. I couldn't live in this limbo, waiting for him to decide what our decade of friendship and months of intimacy meant. If he could pretend it never happened, then so could I. I needed to reclaim my space, my life, my sanity. I needed to prove to him, and more importantly, to myself, that I didn't need him. That's when Mark from the gallery opening texted me. He was nice, handsome in a conventional way, and his interest in me was straightforward and uncomplicated. When he asked me for coffee, I saw it as a lifeline, a way to feel normal, a way to take a step back onto solid ground. I said yes, not because I was particularly interested in Mark, but because I was desperate to stop feeling the phantom weight of Sam's arm around me every night. A few days later, Sam called. His voice was stilted, cautious. He asked how I was, a generic, meaningless question. I decided to answer it with a truth that was also a weapon. I tried to sound casual, breezy, the way he had in his text. "I'm good," I said, walking around my kitchen, trying to sound busy. "Actually, I have a date on Friday." The silence on the other end of the line was instantaneous and profound. It was a digital vacuum. I could almost hear the gears grinding in his head. "A date," he finally said, and his voice was flat, hollowed out. "Yeah, I pushed on, my heart pounding a furious, defiant rhythm. With that guy, Mark, from the gallery opening. It's just coffee. And that's when the carefully constructed wall of his detachment shattered. A sound came through the phone, a sharp, incredulous noise that was half laugh, half gasp. It was the sound of a man being struck. It was the sound that would lead us, hours later, to my kitchen, to the ruin of our unspoken world. His confusion and anger over the phone was so palpable, so raw, that he insisted on coming over. He said we needed to talk. And so I waited, the knot in my stomach tightening with every passing minute, for the confrontation I had both dreaded and, in a strange, pained way, desperately wanted. He had to face what he'd done. He had to face what we were. He stood in my kitchen, his face a storm of conflicting emotions, anger, hurt, confusion. The words hung in the air between us, heavy and immutable. I thought we were just us. The vulnerability in that statement disarmed me completely. My own anger, the protective shell I had carefully constructed, fractured. I saw past the man who had fled in the morning light and saw the man who had whispered, "Would it be okay?" in the dark. They were the same person, torn in two. Us? I finally asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. The word tasted foreign, dangerous. What does that mean, Sam? Tell me what us means. Because a week ago, us meant you kissing me like I was the only person in the world. And the next morning, us meant you sneaking out of my apartment like a thief. So you have to tell me what you think it means. Because I have no idea anymore. My voice cracked on the last few words. The hurt I had been suppressing surged forward, raw and undeniable. I wasn't trying to wound him. I was just showing him my own. He flinched, as if my words were physical blows. He scrubbed a hand over his face, a gesture of profound exhaustion. He wouldn't look at me. He paced the small space between the counter and the table, a caged animal. "I know," he said, his voice ragged. "I know. I'm sorry, Leo. God, I am so sorry for that. For leaving. For how I acted. Sorry doesn't explain it," I said, my voice gaining a bit of strength. "I deserved more than an apology. I deserve the truth. I need to understand, Sam. Why? Why did you kiss me if you were just going to run away?" He stopped pacing and leaned heavily against the counter, right where he had been standing when I'd first told him about the date. He looked defeated. He finally met my gaze, and his eyes were filled with a misery so deep it silenced the last of my anger. "Because I was terrified," he confessed, the words rushing out of him as if a dam had broken. "Leo, kissing you, it felt more right than anything has in years. It felt like coming home, and that scared the hell out of me." He shook his head, looking down at his hands on the counter. "My whole life, I've had this blueprint. You know? College, job, girlfriend, house, future. It was all laid out. I knew who I was supposed to be. And then Chloe left, and the blueprint was just gone. It was all blank pages. And I was adrift. And you were my anchor. You always have been." He took a shaky breath. "Sleeping here, being with you, it was the only time I felt safe. The only time I didn't feel like I was completely lost. And I started to realize that the comfort I was feeling wasn't just about friendship. It was something else. Something I didn't have a name for. Something that didn't fit into any of the boxes I'd built for my life." He looked up at me again, his expression pleading for understanding. "That night, when I kissed you, it was like I was finally admitting it to myself. This is what I want. This person, this feeling. And I woke up the next morning, and the sun was coming up, and I looked at you sleeping, and all I could feel was panic. Pure, animal panic. Because if that was real, then my entire life, everything I thought I knew about myself, was wrong. It was too big. It was too much to process. So I ran. I ran because I'm a coward. I ran back to the person I thought I was supposed to be, because I was too scared to be the person who was lying in your bed." His confession was a torrent, a flood of honesty that washed away all the ambiguity, all the hurt, all the misunderstanding. He hadn't run from me. He had run from himself. He had run from the terrifying, liberating truth that the home he had been searching for was right here, in my quiet apartment, in my arms. "And then you said you had a date," he finished, his voice dropping to a whisper. and it was like the floor just fell out from under me. The thought of you with someone else, of losing this, of losing us, whatever it is, it was unbearable. It was the first thing that's felt real since everything fell apart. And I was about to lose it because I was too afraid to claim it. He fell silent. The entire story was laid bare between us. His fear, his confusion, his profound, terrifying, undeniable feelings. I walked across the small kitchen and stood in front of him. I didn't touch him. I just stood there, letting his words settle into me. "So," I said softly, "you got mad." A watery, broken smile touched his lips. "I got mad," he confirmed, his voice thick with emotion. I finally reached out and laid my hand over his on the counter. His fingers immediately curled around mine, holding on tight. "There is no mark," I said quietly. "There was never going to be a date." He looked at me, his eyes wide with a dawning realization. The last piece of the puzzle clicked into place. He understood that my words had been a desperate attempt to protect myself from him, from the silence he had created. "Oh, Leo," he breathed out, his thumb stroking the back of my hand. The simple touch was an apology, a promise, and a beginning, all at once. The storm had passed. The wreckage was all around us, but for the first time, we were standing in it together, ready to rebuild. In the aftermath of that conversation, something fundamental shifted between us. The ambiguity that had been both a comfort and a torment evaporated, leaving behind a clean, quiet space for something new to grow. We didn't need grand declarations or dramatic pronouncements. The truth, once spoken, settled into the foundations of our relationship and made it solid. The fear didn't vanish overnight, especially for Sam, but it no longer held him captive. We learned to talk about it, to name the anxieties when they surfaced, and in doing so, we robbed them of their power. The ritual of him staying over returned, but it was transformed. There were no more pretexts, no more fictions about uncomfortable couches or cold drafts. He came to my apartment because it was where he wanted to be. It was our space. He brought over a drawer's worth of clothes, then a box of books, then his favorite coffee mug. Slowly, piece by piece, he moved his life into mine, not as a refugee seeking shelter, but as a man building a home. The first time he stayed after our talk, as we got ready for bed, he paused at the bedroom door, which I had always left ajar, a symbolic escape route for us both. He looked at me, a soft, questioning look in his eyes. I nodded, and he reached out and gently, deliberately, clicked the door shut. The sound was quiet, but it resonated with the finality of a vow. The intimacy was no longer a thing of the dark, something to be analyzed or doubted in the morning light. It was present in the easy, everyday moments. It was in the way he'd wrap his arms around me from behind while I was making coffee, resting his chin on my shoulder and humming softly. It was in the way our hands would find each other's while watching a movie on the couch, our fingers lacing together with a casual certainty that still made my heart ache with its simple beauty. The cuddling in bed was no longer a silent negotiation for warmth. It was a conversation, an affirmation of closeness, an anchor in the night that we both held onto willingly. One Saturday morning, I woke up to the smell of brewing coffee. I found Sam in the kitchen, wearing one of my old t-shirts, moving with a familiar ease in the sunlit space. He was no longer a guest. He belonged here. He turned when he heard me, and a slow, easy smile spread across his face. It was the bright, uncomplicated grin I had known for years, but now, it was directed at me in a way that was entirely new. It was for me. He poured me a mug of coffee and handed it to me, his fingers brushing against mine. "Morning," he said, his voice warm and low. "Morning," I replied, and in that simple exchange, there was a world of peace. There were no more questions, no more analyses, no more fear. There was just the quiet, steady rhythm of a life being built together, moment by moment. The photograph I had kept hidden in the dark for so long was finally out in the light, and it was more beautiful and real than I had ever allowed myself to imagine. We learn, I think, that a home is not always a place with four walls and a roof. Sometimes it is a person. It is the safe harbor you find in their presence, the quiet understanding that passes in a shared glance, the profound peace of being known completely. The silence between us was no longer a vacuum of unspoken feelings, but a comfortable, breathing space filled with trust. We had navigated the treacherous currents of fear and confusion, and we had found our way not just back to each other, but to a new shore entirely. We began to heal, not just from our own private wounds, but in the beautiful, honest silence we had finally learned to create together.